Hey, I want to thank everyone. My name is Bill Annabelle. I'm with Digital Polygon, and you are attending the Using Agile to Plan and Execute Better Together session. I know you had a lot of great options to choose from, so I really appreciate the fact that you decided to join me today. Here we go. Technical difficulties. Boom. All right. So today's agenda, real quick, we're going to do a little bit about me, just to give you some background of where I come from. We're going to talk about value and value streams, real government examples of value streams or value stream. We're going to talk about lean agile principles, the importance of cadence and synchronization as it relates to planning and executing better together. And then ultimately, we're gonna actually talk about how to plan as multiple teams working towards a common goal. So looking forward to this. If you have questions, feel free to dump them into the chat or the Q&A section. I'll do my best. I have a lot of slides, but if anything, I have roughly the same amount of slides as yesterday. I did a product management, product owner session, and we had plenty of time at the end to talk and discuss questions. So happy to do so, but I'm probably going to save them for the end. All right, a little bit about me. Again, I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Agilist at Digital Polygon. Digital Polygon is a open source content management services agency that does end-to-end digital agency work on the Drupal and WordPress platforms. I can be contacted via email at bill@digitalpoly.com, oh my goodness, digitalpolygon.com. And I've also put my link to my LinkedIn page right there in the chat. So great to connect. Over the last 2 decades, right, I've worked for some really large integrators, one of the largest consulting firms in the world, a small little software company known as Microsoft. Transitioned over to the agency side, working for Sapient, which was then acquired by Publicis, which is now Publicis Sapient, where I was the CTO of government services. I worked for ICF after that. And then the last couple of jobs I've had is working for smaller firms, much smaller firms, Creative Systems Consulting, which is a women-owned small business, and then Digital Polygon as of late. There's a linkage between Digital Polygon and Sapient. The founder of Digital Polygon and I worked together there. I actually hired him out of college, and he decided to hire me on as he's started to build his firm. All right. Hey, Kieran, welcome. So apologize for these slides for those that saw me yesterday. I'll try to go through them really quick. I've got 21 plus years of experience and living in the Washington, D.C. area. You sit in a lot of traffic prior to COVID. Obviously, since COVID, not so much. And I can tell you that I don't miss the 3 hours. The 3-hour commutes each way, 3-hour commutes daily, right? That does not include all the trains I've taken, the Ubers I've taken, cabs and metro rides I've traversed the Washington, D.C. area with. But it provides me a lot of time to think, well, how much time? Well, 3 hours a day times 5 days times 48 weeks, because, I do take a few weeks off for vacation, 720 hours or 18 weeks of sitting in a car, which gave me lots of time to think about some of these questions that we're going to talk about today. Right. So over these last 2 decades, I have worked across Fed civilian, the intelligence agencies, federal health, FBI, a lot of Department of Homeland Security, as well as most recently USDA and SBA. So let's just say I started on the technical side. I spent the first 10 years really technical, hands-on keyboard, getting stuff done, all the way through Microsoft, where I transitioned more into management architecture roles. Sapient hired me as their CTO, but a year in, I got into organizational change management through mergers and acquisitions, and kind of have been doing mostly an enterprise agile adoption ever since. So but I've been doing it across, I've been doing agile since the early 2000s, various flavors from spirals to XP to Scrum predominantly. And over the last several years, I've really gotten deep into the scaled agile framework. I am an SPC. Which is someone that can actually teach the courses. So the scaled agile courses. So I bring a breadth of experience. I also bring a breadth of different backgrounds, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today. So in order to plan better together, particularly in the digital age, you're going to start hearing about value and value streams, right? Particularly across an organization. And I don't care if this is a government organization or commercial organization. But ultimately, the customer and bringing them value is key. Now, customer is a really interesting word in the government because we don't have customers per se. They could be constituents. They could be civilians. They could be actual customers, right? Because there are those that need loans from the Department of Education to go to school, right? A lot of us may have experienced that process in the government. We're actually going to talk about it at length a little bit. Um, some organizations need to go through customs, right? We all go through customs, but there are actually organizations that have to pay for customs. Some people need visas, they pay for those, right? Sometimes we have to go to the IRS and figure out what our taxes are, right? These are services that we are customers to the government for, right? So, also don't forget the employees, right? The employees at each one of these agencies are actually customers of these systems as well. So we need to understand their needs and the value we need to bring to them. And we do that through value streams. So what is value, right? Well, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, a value is a noun. It's a fair return or equivalent in goods, services, or money for something exchanged, right? Relative worth, utility, and importance, right? So again, we've talked about those things. If I need a visa, I'm going to go to CIS. I'm going to apply for a visa. If I need to find out about my taxes, chances are I'm going to IRS. If I need a loan, I'm going to go to studentaid.gov, which is run by the Department of Education, and I'm going to fill out an application, right? I need some sort of value, right? And a value stream represents the series of steps that an organization uses to implement solutions that provide a continuous flow of value to a customer. Now, again, in the digital age, think about, and for those of you on the experience design side, customer experience and customer journey mapping really starts to articulate this, right? Because we talk about all the touch points that a customer goes through as they're interfacing with an agency, private or public sector, as they're trying to get something accomplished, right? We talk about what they like about that experience, what they don't like about that experience, but we also identify the processes that are supporting those experiences as well as the systems. And so for those that have done experience design, both user experience design and customer experience design, you're probably very familiar with the concept of value stream, maybe just not heard it in this way. I could be wrong, but I just kind of trying to bring the two worlds together. There are two types of value streams: operational value streams and development value streams. Operational value streams really do represent the path, the high-level process that a customer goes through as they try to get something accomplished, right? So in this case, the example is some sort of loan process, right? And then there's all types of channels that we might interface with as end users to get to where we need to go. That could be social, that could be web, that could be mobile, right? And then we have to log in, and then we have to fill out some applications giving us our backgrounds, right? And ultimately we get approved for the loan on the backside. Well, that one operational value stream, right, is typically supported by multiple systems or development value streams, right? So this gives you two examples, right? But the development value streams are the steps and the processes that people who develop the business solutions use to provide value to the customer when it's all said and done. So this is typically operational value streams to development value streams is a one-to-many relationship. So I promised an example. I've already alluded to it, but let's talk about the fact that I have a college student at Virginia Tech. We are a Hokie family, and we have a lot of recent experience, right, with the Department of Education via the FAFSA process, which is the process by which people can, potential students and their parents can actually go and find financial aid, right? That could be grants, that could be loans, that could be work study funds, right? From the Department of Education. The Department of Education doles out $120 billion in grants, loans, and work study as it relates to the education of the American citizen. So it's something to think about, right? And we're gonna and because it is such a popular process, they've done a really nice job, right, of creating a value stream. Yep, I just finished the FAFSA process actually with my son, so we're getting there. So what I was really excited about when I started doing some research on this is that the Department of Education via studentaid.gov has created all types of assets that make it super easy for end users to understand what process they have to follow, right? So in this case, coming straight from studentaid.gov, right? We have to create a username and password. We actually have to fill out the FAFSA form for 2021, 2022. We have to complete the student demographic action. And this is the students, right? So they understand that they actually have multiple personas. They have a student persona, and they have a parent persona. They also have a school persona as implied through some of these steps. But ultimately we work our way through, right? We give demographic information. The parents get looped in. We kind of validate all that demographic information. And then That information is then supplied back to the schools that we indicate we need the student loan for, and ultimately we have to sign it and hopefully get approved for whatever financial aid we are capable of getting as individual families. Right? This is a perfect example of an operational value stream, right? Because we know the value that is needed at the end of the process. We know the steps of the process, right? And expectations are there will be value at the end of, by the time we hit the finish line here. So this is a little bit of a build slide, but if the FAFSA process from the student view is the operational value stream, right? And I am no expert on the FAFSA process other than I am an end user of it. I'm the parent part of the personas. That said, just looking at this, you can see that there are multiple systems involved in this. There's a website, right, which has its own development value stream. There's at least the FAFSA application software behind the scenes that has to integrate likely with the website. And it talks about the IRS data retrieval tool. So we have the IRS data retrieval tool, all of which have their own development life cycles, right? And their own development value streams, right? So when you have one process supported by multiple systems, and by the way, there are more systems, I am sure, right? Because there's login.gov and all those type of things that are in there. But just for example purposes, the slide would get really busy if I actually did the research to find out how many actual systems are in there, but I think you get the idea. But when you have multiple systems trying to provide a single service, we have lots of dependencies, right? And those dependencies could zigzag across various systems, but I kept it fairly simple, right? Obviously, the website and the application have to be fairly well integrated, as is the login process. But obviously, when it's time at the process point where we have to pull and validate IRS information, then we not only have dependencies, but we have multiple agencies involved, which complicate things, right? So how do we start to adjust this, right? How do we plan for this? How do we do a better job? Now, it is really hard, quite frankly, and I don't think we're not going to really address the fact that there are multiple agencies involved in this. But within Department of Education, at a minimum, we identified 2 development value streams that we want to kind of use as the example moving forward in the rest of this conversation, to kind of highlight how and why teams should actually work together to get things done. And how we can make them more, and how we can optimize them in a way to plan better and execute better together. So yesterday we talked quite a bit about all of these. Lean Agile principles are part of the Scaled Agile framework. I don't think if you were to read all of these, and I will not read them to you today, I'll pick out one of my favorites, which is visualize and limit work in progress, reduce batch sizes of managed queue lengths. I'm a big Kanban guy. If I could Kanban the world and visualize everyone's work, I would, and I do on a fairly regular basis. I apply these concepts to business teams, to development teams, to mission-centric teams, so that they understand how much work is going on, how much, right? And we can limit how much work, because let's face it, as human beings, we're not very good at multitasking. So if we can prioritize the work for folks, the development teams or the teams themselves, and we can keep them hyper-focused on 1 or 2 things, work in progress limits, right? Creating those limits, we know that things are going to get done faster because they're highly focused and they know that they're working on the things that the business needs. That all said, we also can make smaller jobs so they go through the process faster, and then we can manage the queue lengths, and that's the prioritization part. But for the remainder of our conversation today, we're going to talk about applying cadence, synchronization, and cross-domain planning, because dependent teams, not just development teams, but there are mission teams, there are infrastructure and cloud teams, there are design teams, and and then there's all types of layers of management, from project management, program management, perhaps product owner and product management. But there's a lot of stakeholders involved when working in value streams and the systems that support them. And ultimately, those that plan and execute better together are going to have a lot more success. So what is cadence? I'm aging myself here, but with 20 plus years of experience, this is Neil Peart. He passed away, I believe, last year. He was, in my opinion, the best drummer to ever play the drums. He's the former Rush drummer, and he could keep a beat. Right. So cadence is a rhythmic pattern of events that provides the steady heartbeat of the development process. Right. And that, remember, development process can be the development of code, of systems, of various products. Right. That could be, like, I think about government, we create lots of policy. Well, that could be considered a product. We create reports for for Congress, right? We create all type, any one of those things we create in government, be it a system or some sort of policy documentation, could be considered a product. Cadence enables dependent teams, or teams that rely on each other to stay synchronized, right? Identify dependencies and collectively manage risk. If we are in different cadences, and you'll see in just a bit, then risks increases, right? So what's synchronization? And using another government example, right? If these poor guys in the US Navy, right, these are the Blue Angels, if they get out of sync, and as close as they're flying, they can get into some serious trouble. Well, that applies to developing systems and developing products as well, right? So what's synchronization? Allows multiple solution perspectives to be understood, resolved, and integrated at the same time, and enables dependent teams to stay in cadence. Cool. So what are the benefits of cadence and synchronization together, right? So yesterday, I pulled this CIO risk rating from the IT dashboard. And for those of you that don't know what the IT dashboard is in the government, there's a process called capital planning and investment control that every executive department and certain agencies must update on a monthly basis as it relates to their big investments that are monitored by Congress and funded by Congress, right? What stands out to you as you look at, or at least to me, as you look at this, is that the 54.2% are either medium or high risk, right? And these are IT projects, large IT projects in many cases. Given that I have some insider baseball on how these numbers are created, although this looks quite objective and objective, I can tell you there's some gray space in the way these numbers are actually reported. So going back a few years, Standish Group has a chaos database where 87% of large government projects are challenged and or failed, right? I don't know that it's as bad as 87%, but I can tell you, I think it's higher than that 54% we just talked about. So keep that in mind, right? And I always ask myself, why are these projects struggling, right? Well, let's dive into that, right? When independent agile teams, so individual teams, they do a really nice job of applying consistent cadence, right, via short iterations of cycles. Some of you in Scrum might call that a sprint. Some in SAFe may call it an iteration. Whatever you may call it, typically those iterations are 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is. It varies from agency to agency. That said, right, various teams, in this case, team 1, 2, and 3, have different length cadences, and they actually start at different times just by looking at this team. If these teams become dependent, right, we're introducing risk by virtue of the fact that we're not on the same cadence and we're not starting at the same time, right? Because the dependent teams working towards a common goal or release are not synchronized. It creates communication breakdowns. It creates bottlenecks and dependencies because teams have to wait. This implies that the teams aren't actually planning together. They may be communicating, but they're not planning together. So if team 1 is completely dependent on team 3 to provide a specific service for them to consume from a development perspective, and team 1 has actually planned to do that in the second iteration, but team 3 hasn't planned to provide the dependent solution until their third iteration, you can start to see where it breaks down and where delays can occur. Not only that, team 1 may make some assumptions about what team 3 is going to do and have to do quite a bit of rework when it comes through and it's not as they expected. So in this case, we don't have a real way of knowing if the intended progress is being made because we can't integrate easily and we can't plan for it, those dependencies. And as from a product management or project management perspective, it's really difficult to understand progress across teams. It's a little bit easier to see progress at the individual team level, but when you look at it holistically, it becomes nearly impossible, right? So how do you address this? Well, we use both cadence and synchronization to get those teams on the same iteration timeline. So if it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, they're on the same and they start on the same day, right? So all of a sudden there's alignment. And when we start to do that, we are reducing the risk because stakeholders can actually start to see progress through the demo process. We call it the system demo process. That system demo happens at the end of each iteration. So if we're doing 2-week sprints, it's at the end of each sprint. We're doing demos, but it's way beyond that, right? Right? And if you know about anything about the Agile Manifesto, demos of working software are the true test of progress. Well, in that case, we need to be showing progress, not screen captures, not PowerPoint presentations. We need to be showing working software to prove that all the work that we're doing is actually successful. And when you do that across teams, it starts to force a conversation about planning for those dependencies in a smart way. So that team one, who was going back to our example on the previous slide, team one, who is dependent on team three, can work and plan together about the dependent. Team three would say, oh wait, I have a dependency for team one, let me move that into my first iteration. And then team one can then say, in our second iteration, we'll start to leverage what team three built in the first iteration, so that we don't waste our time in our work. And it allows us to start sequencing work in a really smart way. Right, we can not only identify dependencies, but we can identify blockers between teams. We can start to discuss risk as a team and as like a program, and integrate faster when on the same cadence while staying synchronized. And by doing so, we can make better decisions. In other words, we get faster feedback, and with that feedback, we can pivot as necessary, because as we've been talking about, in the digital age, requirements change early and often, right? And it's never going to stop, because that's what the demands of the digital age has placed upon us. So cadence plus synchronization equals better outcomes. And I hit a lot of these points already, but really, if cadence is all about converting unpredictable events into predictable ones, right? That can ultimately lower costs, because there's less rework to do. It makes waiting times for new work predictable. Again, talked about that quite a bit with the dependencies between team one and team three. Support regular planning and cross-functional coordination, right? So in order coordinated, we actually have to plan, and we're going to in greater detail. So let's hold off on that. We talked about limiting batch sizes to a single interval. So in other words, all the work that is planned for a single iteration at the team level should be done by the end of that iteration, right? Jobs that get done within teams should not span multiple iterations. If they do, they need to be broken into smaller chunks, so to speak, of work, or batch sizes, as we like to call it, so that we can show progress and ensure that any dependencies on that progress are being met. It also controls the injection of new work, because teams typically have fixed capacities. And ultimately, if we have changing priorities, we have to let them finish what they're doing. And if we're not willing to do that, then we have to reprioritize the work they're working on. Ideally, in a product development lifecycle where we have these iterations, we're not changing midstream or mid-iteration. That injects a lot of variability into the system, which then requires rework down the road. So ultimately, we want to make sure we finish what we get started in each iteration, and then pivot as necessary based on the feedback we receive. And then it provides scheduled integration points. Like I said, one of the biggest bottlenecks of all when it comes to developing systems are the integration points between those systems. Just like we talked about FAFSA with the web and the FAFSA application plus the IRS. When we're building new systems or we're upgrading systems and there are integration points, we need to do that as early in the process as possible, so we can identify challenges, because there's always challenges. On the synchronization side, it causes multiple events to happen at the same time. Just like we said, the teams have the same interval in terms of how long the iterations are. That can be 2, 3, 4 weeks, depending on the agency, as long as every team. But it's also about starting on the same day and ending on the same day. That's how we can actually start to depend on each other and eliminate some of the risks. It facilitates cross-functional trade-offs, right? The teams can talk. We can say, oh no, you're going to do that. You're planning to do this. Well, our system already does that. We can make that available to you. And all of a sudden, some work that was planned can be used. Some work that was planned may not even be necessary. But because we're talking across teams, we're having better communication, making better decisions when it's all said and done. It provides for routine dependency management. Been talking about that ad nauseum, so I'm not going to keep, but it allows the actual product management team and the product owners to actually visualize and manage dependencies. And I'll give you an example of that in just a bit. And then support full system and integration and assessment. So again, if we don't have working software and we have dependent systems that are integrated, and the integration fails, then we don't have working software. And if we don't have working software, then we're not making the progress we expect. And ultimately, by being synchronized and we are able to provide multiple feedback perspectives on a regular basis. And you're going to see that in just a bit, right? We are all very familiar at the team level right? Retrospectives allow us to provide feedback. Those system demos allow us customers to provide feedback and stakeholders to provide feedback. And that is critical for making sure that we're meeting the value and providing value and as part of the value stream to our customers, right? So planning better together, what does that look like? Well, going back to our example, right, of this operational value stream, and let's say focused on the Department of Education side, but ultimately, let's assume there's only the 2 development value streams supporting the FAFSA process or the FAFSA value stream, right? We start to look at what planning looks like. Well, traditionally in government, let's face it, right, and I've been doing this a long time, we tend, if you look at just the acquisition process historically, is really an infrequent one-time planning process, right? Which is proven to increase risk and require more rework, right? And as you can see through this little chart here, because we're only planning once, there's a lot more deviation from the plan, right? Which is variance, and with variance becomes a lot of rework, right? The more variance we have, there's a lot of unknowns. We're not getting fast feedback, and ultimately, how many times have we all kind of experienced that because we didn't have fast feedback cycles in the loop, so we can't make better decisions. And so conversely, we have cadence-based planning, right, which is a requirement of the digital age. And that's a shift really from that project to a product methodology that is required for really continued success and for continued adding value to the customer. It's cadence-based. It allows for that customer feedback to happen more often. Are we building the right thing, right? Well, if we're starting to condense the amount of, let's say, long-term planning into, say, medium-term planning, and you'll see in just a sec what that might look like, then you start to, you get faster feedback cycles. You get it in the hands of the customer faster, and they can provide valuable feedback that will actually make our requirements stronger and better and ensure that the value is being provided to the customer and that it will be used in a successful manner. But how is that accomplished? Well, there are a variety of what they are called scaling agile type of frameworks, including Scrum at Scale or the Scaled Agile framework. And they are massive frameworks that are a whole nother session onto themselves. That said, what's important to understand is that these frameworks, and I'm only using these 2 examples, there are many others, have a series of cross-team planning events, right? And in Scrum at Scale, you have this cross-team coordination, right? You have kind of this whole product side, which is the what side. You have the master cycle, the Scrum master cycle, which is on the left side. And ultimately, you have the teams getting together on a fairly regular basis to continue to coordinate on an ongoing basis, right? And to plan product release schedules and what they call a product increment, right? A product increment is a fixed amount of time where we do some outward planning that usually is multiple iterations to get some work done, right? In the Scaled Agile framework, right, we have the same, right? They're called program increments, right? Or PI planning events that happen. And that's where all the teams, all the stakeholders, the vision, the mission, the business, the product management, the development teams, any support teams from communications to infrastructure to design teams all get in a room and start to plan together for a series of times. And then at the end, much like we do in a sprint where we have some sprint planning in the very beginning and we have a retro at the end, we actually do what is called inspect and adapt in the Scaled Agile framework, retrospectives, which are cross-team retrospectives that includes all the people that help plan it. So we get together on a regular basis, not frequent, but regular, as an entire group so that the business is aligned, the development teams are aligned, and all the support teams are aligned to getting out the product and ultimately planning better together, right? So cross-team planning, regardless of the frameworks, right, tend to be somewhere between 5 to 12 iterations, depending on the length of the iterations, or usually no more than a quarterly basis. It provides a framework for dependent teams to get in cadence and maintain synchronization. That's what we've been talking about, and was really required for teams to be successful in this world. It establishes face-to-face communications for the teams, right? So oftentimes with different contracts and different teams responsible for different things across the government, the way kind of the business is structured, we don't even know who we're interfacing with. And this forces everyone to get in a room to plan better together, right? To speak a common language. It aligns all the teams on the goals, be it business goals or the development goals, and also kind of on the mission and the context and the vision. that the business owners are most concerned about, and it ensures that everyone is on the same page. As we've been talking about, it identifies dependencies across teams, and sometimes forces agency collaboration, cross-agency collaboration. So, and it matches demand to capacity. So when we met, you're going to hear a lot about that in the product development world, is that every team has a fixed capacity, and understanding each team's fixed capacity and what they're capable of will help us plan better together and ensure rework. That work for a team that may be overburdened can be distributed across multiple teams. And then ultimately, as we talked about earlier, we want to eliminate as much work in progress as possible across teams so that we have faster decision making, and it allows us to reprioritize on a regular basis. Now, this picture is of a program board. It's called From Scale to Agile, but it's really important because you start to see that we have multiple teams that are named as unicorns, dolphins, bears, etc., the animals. And then each iteration within that actual PI, they have actually 5 iterations, so 5 2-week iterations across the entire program increment, so roughly 10 weeks. And during that time, right, we know what features are being developed by what team. We know what significant dependencies, colored in red, right, exist across teams, right? And we have major milestones or events that are happening. That could be releases, that could be some conferences we need to go to, or some demo that we have to actually show to someone. And the reg streams are the dependencies between teams. And now by visualizing all of this, right, by getting all the teams and having them talk about this, we can actually start to re-coordinate and kind of move reorganize the checkerboard in a way that we can start to sequence these dependencies from one team to the other are aligned and sequenced so that both teams can be successful. There's no more waiting. With less waiting actually comes less variance. With less variance comes more success and less risk. Cross-team retrospectives, right? This is an actual picture of an inspect and adapt event. That's a scaled agile event, where at the end we do a retro for the entire increment, be that 10 weeks or quarterly, depending on the organization. It includes all stakeholders, right? It includes a product demo. So all those work across all, not only do we have system demos at the end of each iteration, but at the end of the cross-team retrospective, we actually do a product demo, which is everything. Here are all the features we plan for, and here's how they work together, right? And everyone gets in a room, and even the business folks, right? And then we kind of assess all the quantitative and qualitative measurements, and there's a plethora of them and no real way for me to go through them independently here today. But that's everything from team velocity to program velocity, to business objectives expected versus business objectives met, right? So not only are we looking at critically at the metrics of the development teams, be it right, we burn down versus velocity, cross teams in the program, but we're also holding our business owners accountable for and helping them learn how to prioritize better in the future by saying, okay, we had expected a certain amount of business value, right? When we talked about customer value, business value, and we graded them, which helped us prioritize. But and that was expected. But at the end, during the retro, we actually forced them to regrade it to see if what we produced actually met their expectations. Or perhaps after they've seen it, they realize, wow, that wasn't as big a priority as I thought. Really, retrospectives are about learning and improving over time. And that's what a cross-team retrospective actually helps with, right? And then we typically have a problem-solving workshop where we identify any number of opportunities to improve moving into the next PI increment or the next increment kind of team planning events. And that way we can improve as a team. Obviously, we still do this at the Scrum level, where we do our retros, but it just takes the retro and applies it across that kind of 8 to 12 week time frame. And with that, thank you for your time today. And if there are any questions, I am happy to answer them. Just type them into the chat right here, and I can be happy to stick around and answer as many questions as we can. Just asked the question, any tools you'd recommend for backlog management and Kanban boards? I come from private sector where we use Jira, but my agency just has Office 365. I'm trying to avoid project management by Excel only. Andrew, great question. I'm a Jira fan as well. We use Jira software. We use Confluence. I even use their service desk currently. I would say it depends on the organization. If you're using Office 365, they have, what is it called? Planner, Teams Planner. That's one way. It's not the best way, but it is definitely, it is better than nothing, or Excel in my opinion. However, it is missing a lot of the bells and whistles that a Jira brings to bear. Also, if you're in Office 365, you might want to look into, are you a Microsoft shop? There are some Microsoft tools for Agile development that also include many of the Jira-like functionalities. It just depends on your organization. I've seen teams use Trello as well, as a means for getting it done. Any other great questions here on YouTube? Trello. Yep. So yeah, those are the three: Planner, Trello, and Jira. Jira obviously being one of the best ones, in my opinion, because it's such a robust system, really designed to do that kind of Kanban management and visualization of work. Yeah, it's got some serious limitations, but it does allow you to actually visualize, Andrew. Good luck with that, man. Any other questions? Well, I'm happy to stick around and answer any more questions. I know I'm going to give you back a few minutes of your time. I truly appreciate all the time you took today to spend with me as I talked about planning better together. And ultimately, I wish you all the greatest success. Love to connect. Feel free to reach out to me. And I'd be even happy to have a one-on-one if you have any specific questions you want me to help you with. Enjoy the rest of the conference and take care, everybody.